next film we're going to review is MOFFIE. Betty, why don't you tell us a little bit about that film?
Okay, so MOFFIE is a South African film directed by Oliver Hermanus, and it's based on a novel by Andre Karl van der Merwe. It's set in 1981 during the South African border wars, um, and it is about the life and times of Nick, who is a gay teenager who has just been conscripted into the South African Defense Force. The film mostly follows his experience of being in the military, not just as a gay man, but as a young boy in general, and it mainly focuses on the militarization of these young men and the way that this militarization stifles them as people in general, but especially as a man who is, going to be inherently discriminated against as a homosexual, which is also reflected in the title of the film, which is a Afrikaans slur that's pejorative towards gay men.
Yeah, and I've got to say, on that note, I think I know far more Afrikaans curse words than I'm really comfortable knowing after watching this film. In particular, there's one which is used repeatedly, pimpled. See you next Tuesday. And I know that because it's used so repeatedly, and it kind of speaks to how brutal this film is. So it follows Nick as part of, I think it was like the 2 years mandatory military service as, part of the South African army around the time they were having issues with the Soviet-backed Angola on their border. And I wouldn't say I like this film, because that would be very much the wrong way to talk about it. I personally was very impressed by it. It's got a lot going for it, which is extremely effective. Chiefly amongst it, I think the look. It's a very up-close and personal look to the film. It's usually characterized by handheld close-ups, and it's remarkably sharp-looking. In particular, also does a very good job of putting you there in kind of time and place through the cinematography, which I think is really extremely effective. It's kind of got this sun-bleached look to it almost. And the music as well, I found really, really quite remarkable. In some ways, it actually reminded me of something we reviewed on the show recently. It actually reminded me of Little Joe in some ways. Not entirely, because that kind of kabuki style of that was really a part, but it ended up with that same sort of effect of unsettling you, and it sounds a bit atonal, and knocking you off balance. So I think it's a very effective film. It's quite an uncomfortable film to watch. Kind of all these different intersecting bigotries, really. We open with an extremely unpleasant scene quite early on of a bunch of white soldiers basically abusing and, in a rather disgusting way, assaulting a black man at a train station. And then, of course, after that, it starts to focus a little bit more on kind of the toxic masculinity and the homophobia, which is rife in the setting that Nick, this young man, finds himself in. But yeah, I don't know I don't know what you thought overall, Betty, but I personally find it extremely effective, extremely affecting, and I think the performances were pretty good as well. I think it got across what it wanted to. It's not comfortable to watch.
Yeah, I quite like the film overall, and a lot of it has to do with the same reasons that you mentioned, and especially with the cinematography itself. I thought every shot was very thoughtfully composed, and what I found interesting as well was that it doesn't use a strictly speaking widescreen aspect ratio. It uses the Academy ratio, which is a bit more square. Um, and I read that the director of photography, Jamie D. Ramsey, used this, like not just the aspect ratio, but the feel of the film in general, was meant to emulate the war photography that he saw of this period, because he found the way that this that these wars were documented to be very impactful, and I think he succeeded in that. I feel like he succeeded in that overall. There's there are very few decisions that were made in terms of composition and in terms of the coloring of the film that felt superfluous. I felt like everything was very motivated and very, very carefully done. So in terms of storyline itself, one thing I thought that which was interesting. So when I went in to watch this, I was expecting a film that was primarily centered around the difficulties of being, a gay man in the military. But I feel like that was only one of the many aspects of this kind of life, and spending a good chunk of your formative years in this kind of environment, which usually involves difficulties of all kinds, not just ones that relate to you growing up, you growing into your sexuality and growing into your romantic life, which is in a way sort of something that many LGBT people are robbed of. And that's extra true for any man, in this kind of setting. I don't think that takes a back seat by any means, but it does become just one of the many issues that Nick faces, amongst them, being a 19-year-old, being a teenager, fighting a war that he's not even sure is justified or that he's even on the right side of.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the thing about the war photography in particular, because actually the aspect ratio and just the way the shots are framed and everything, it really does evoke that quite strongly. What's interesting though is the film is definitely not above kind of poking at and subverting some of these kind of military homoerotic tropes that occasionally pop up in film. And the one I'm thinking of, there's pointedly, without giving anything away, there's a topless volleyball scene, which of course is something which Top Gun is famous for having. But without giving anything away, that scene, which up to that point is, it's reasonably, as this film goes, it's reasonably lighthearted. It is then absolutely brutally undercut in like very swift fashion. So it is a very unflinching film in that regard, and I think it's taking aim at some of these maybe slightly more sanitized views of how these things have gone down in the past. And I think much of it comes down to how well the Nick character is portrayed, and I think the person who plays him, his name is Kai Luke Broomer, and I think he does an absolutely superb job. And he has these kind of moments with other soldiers who are also kind of hiding themselves, basically, or hiding their real selves in this very testing, bigoted environment, and it does it superbly. I think it is extremely effective, and there's a lot going on. I think the experience of gay men in the South African military, that's obviously the primary thing, and I think given that we're dealing with the apartheid regime, I think some people would probably be a little disappointed that seems to the overtly racist aspects of that take a back seat, and it seems to focus more on the effect that it has, just generally, like the generally toxic effect of it. So I could see people maybe thinking that's been overlooked, but I think that's just the nature of this particularly sort of personal angle to the story that is being told.
Yeah, I think, if you could, like, in terms of the social impact of the film, I think the one thing anybody could hold against it is that it's sort of trying to humanize the white soldiers in the South African Defense Force. But, ultimately, these experiences are fundamentally human, and if I had to compare it to any other, any other war that experiences a lot of sort of that is often seen in various cultural products, I'd probably compare it most to Vietnam. and the American soldiers in Vietnam and the difficulties that they face in terms of being part of what will in history be remembered as a very unpopular war in any case. I think it does ultimately depict these things quite elegantly in the sense that it's a pretty obvious and explicit criticism of the militarization of society and the the ideological effects of it, um, which might not be depicted uh, strictly in terms of race relations, but it is something that features in the film quite prominently in other ways, I think.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I must admit, the thing that struck me about it the most initially was the visuals. I think it does a very good job of drawing you into that. All the stuff that you've spoken about. It does a very good job of drawing you into that. In particular, there's a bunch of shots following a train transporting these guys to the kind of the camp, which has basically got a bit of a Full Metal Jacket vibe to it. Complete with abusive sergeants and the whole shebang. But a lot of the shots of the train making its way to there are really quite stunning, actually. And there's a couple of different ones. There's ones that are kind of, slightly side on tracking from above. There are others where it comes from below the camera and then disappears kind of into the horizon of the shot. And it really looks superb. It is probably like they're kind of like entering hell, really, and it is scored as such as well, and that's where the music I was talking about earlier comes into it. It really does a fantastic job of setting that tone, and then after that it goes on to explore these kind of different issues and the personal relationships and how these men, both how some of these men express themselves in a way that is condoned, and then the other way in which they need to hide the ways they can't express themselves in. And it does a fantastic job of setting that up. And overall, I've got to say, I was really, really pretty impressed.
I'm a little bit ambivalent about the soundtrack, just in the sense that, like, the soundtrack itself is very good, but I think the only thing I would hold against the film is that it tends to, the film tends to at times be a little bit put aside for these like slightly longer soundtracky digressions, which sometimes for me really helped set the mood and create create a setting and an atmosphere for the film, but other times felt just a little bit distracting in the sense that, like, you'll have scenes that sort of overlap and it feels like they're not really sure whether they want to dedicate the, more contemplative musical bit to this scene or another scene. So they do both. And sometimes I felt like they could drag on a little bit, but ultimately, like, it is pretty obvious what it's trying to do, if nothing else, and that's create a more overall aesthetic experience of whatever scene is trying to be depicted in this way, which from the brawls in the brawls between the boys, paired with very dramatic classical music, to Nick swimming in a pool and stuff like that.
Okay, so you can see MOFFIE on Curzon Home Cinema on the 24th of April, so be sure to check it out.